George R. R. Martin and Hidetaka Miyazaki are renowned for writing stories that both criticize and deconstruct those in power. Morality takes a backseat to strategy, and the actions of those in power consistently have unforeseen consequences far into the future. This inclination towards this type of storytelling made the announcement that George R. R. Martin would be helping Miyazaki create the world of his next game an exciting one. He was tasked with writing the history and lore of the universe so that Miyazaki could take his Jenga tower of lords and dragons and demigods and send it all crashing down. Miyazaki is also well known for the lore of his games centered around complicated and esoteric examinations of the extreme extent willpower can be called upon when challenging or disrupting the cycles perpetuating all the suffering and loss seen throughout the world. However, when the Elden Ring DLC came out, and after a long wait I entered the Land of Shadow for the first time, I wasn't met with a church administering the blood of Lovecraftian beings to the populace. I wasn't met with a golden order unnaturally stifling the processes of life and death. I was met with dejected crusaders whose purpose was long forgotten, a once proud nation called the Hornsent, who built a tower spiraling into the heavens but now live in the ashes of their own destruction, surrounded by scorched city ruins and beheaded statues of their subjugator, who ironically stands as a symbol of the once seductive promise of eternal life. These statues are of Queen Marika, who used the Hornsent's tower that reached out to divinity to unleash eternal retribution on them. To quote one of the NPCs you can meet in this land, when asked about the Hornsent, she says, "Long ago, Queen Marika commanded Sir Mesmer to purge the Tower Folk, cleansing by fire. It's no wonder the Hornsent holds the Erdtree in such contempt. That aside, man is by nature a creature of conquest, and in this regard, the Tower Folk are no different. They were never saints, they just happened to be on the losing side of a war." The Hornsent were an extremely pagan culture, but also a very spiritual one. They believed that they had, and they alone possessed, a closeness to divinity. They saw those covered in horns, particularly horns that spiraled, as those with the greatest connection to the divine. And perhaps this explains their treatment of the shamans, Marika's people. The shamans were not born with spiraling or coarse horns knotting their skin. Instead, they had smooth and soft skin that was said to meld harmoniously with others, whatever that means. We find the details of this inhumane treatment in the descriptions of several items, and it's grotesque. The shamans were whipped until their bodies were tender and placed into jars full of the bodies of criminals and other people Hornsent society frowned upon, all in a twisted desire for the blameless souls and harmonious flesh of the shamans to purify the rest that was crammed into these burial jars with them. We even hear one spirit telling a shaman, "For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh sainthood itself awaits you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life were you accorded for this alone." Queen Marika took the memory of this harrowing fate bestowed to her people by the Hornsent and carried a very base and primal desire for retribution with her long after she ascended to godhood. And when she'd reached the peak of her power, when her order of eternal life and boundless gold had really taken root, she sent her son to burn them all to the ground. Marika obscured these sins from the world and abandoned her son Mesmer, his armies, and the Hornsent as well, to languish in shadow and ash, cut off from the rest of the world. Only through the actions of Miquella, brother to Melania, and son of Miquella and Radahn, are we able to even get here in the first place. You hear a lot about Miquella in the base game. Many talk of him with flowery language, singing his praises as Miquella the kind, the compassionate, the savior of the downtrodden, but even before I got my hands on this DLC, I had questions. The Bewitching branch is an item that talks about Miquella learning very well how to compel love from others. And looking back, this was the single biggest clue left in the base game to his true nature. As we move throughout the Lands of Shadow, we find crosses where Miquella sacrificed pieces of his demigod flesh on his journey to become a god. Miquella did not come to this land alone. His followers populate the Land of Shadow, and many of them can be found tracing his steps through the crosses, same as you. Out of all who follow him, though, none are more telling, or have more zeal or drive to follow him than Leda. Leda presents an interesting dichotomy in Miquella's character, as though she is the most loyal to him, and of course, by proxy, his age of compassion. She's the least trusting, and possibly one of, if not, the most bloodthirsty characters you will meet. Compare this with Ansbach, one of the followers of Mohg, Lord of Blood, aka Mohg the Omen. You guys know who I'm talking about. Anyway, a pretty reviled demigod, to say the least, as he was an omen, was raised in the sewers, and he split off from the Golden Order and rejected his lineage in persecution to follow the formless mother, who is essentially a blood god. But we find out, through Ansbach, that things played out very differently, as most people in the Lands Between assumed that Mohg kidnapped Miquella, but in fact it was the other way around. Miquella bewitched Mohg and used his, armies and his palace and its secrecy as simply tools to further his plan and enter the Land of Shadow, which of course would culminate in him becoming a god. Seeing Miquella's manipulation for what it was, being the former commander of Mohg's pureblood knights, Ansbach challenged Miquella once he knew the truth of his hold over Mohg, and even managed to land a pretty clean hit that cut Miquella open, but his efforts would be in vain. Ansbach would end up in the Land of Shadow under the same bewitching enchantment as Mohg, Leda, and all the others. Many of these bewitched followers serve different masters, and once the story is progressed enough, Miquella's enchantment breaks, and we see how quickly many of them are at each other's throats. Leda begins attempting to assassinate one of the Hornsent who worked with you, and even Ansbach, if you let her get far enough, We even learn from the armor of another Needle Knight, who you can find near the entrance to the Land of Shadow, that she killed the rest of their order of knights for doubting their allegiance to Miquella. Leda is single-handedly one of the best pieces of evidence both for and against Miquella's reign. Leda is bloodthirsty, she's jealous, paranoid, but under the spell of Miquella. She's loyal, she's collaborative, and even kind. However, her devotion to Miquella, enchantment or not, is much like Melania in the sense that it leads to unknown amounts of destruction upon the world. Why would a god of compassion need inquisitors or secret police like her in the first place? A protector, sure, but when you really look at how many loyal to him and under his spell behave, it becomes clear that this is not a peaceful being. This is a lord who sees all the problems and pain in the world and offers an opiate, but changes nothing. Which brings us to the question of whether his subjugation of the will of characters like Leda, Melania, and even Radahn is truly for the greater good or not. Let's focus on Radahn for a second, because like Leda, he is also a glaring contradiction to this so-called Age of Compassion. Radahn is this land's equivalent to, well, I guess you would say a god of war. This big bastard is the poster child for individuality and willpower and badassery in this game. Radahn, he mastered control of gravity through sorcery simply because he liked his horse but had grown too swole and massive to ride him normally without crushing him. He then used this same magic to halt the movement of the stars, which spelled doom for the town that taught him this sorcery, and just conquered the stars with his manipulation of gravity and holds the fate of the cosmos at a standstill because he's just that sick, I guess. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the guy, he also beat on Miquella's supposedly undefeated sister so badly she had to resort to the medieval equivalent of a nuclear bomb just to bring the fight to a stalemate. Which brings me to the next question of, did Radahn willingly become Miquella's consort? And look, this is up to speculation, we don't know for sure, but if you ask me, fuck no. And let me tell you why. We already know Miquella's proclivity for manipulation and using others to serve his own benefit regardless of what they want, but let's take that investigation and look a little deeper into his character. In the base game, you hear about this fabled land of Miquella's Erdtree and many of the unfortunate members of races or peoples or groups that are looked down upon in the lands between. They see this place as a safe haven for the persecuted, for the meek, but when you find it for yourself, it's plague-ridden. It's like a decaying tree stump filled with worms. It's almost a hellhole in certain parts of it. There's beauty to be sure, but whatever beauty really was there has long rotted away, and it's strange. There's something uncanny and unnatural about it. When you walk up to a lot of Miquella's soldiers, the rank and file, right, they don't attack you initially because many of them are just staring off into the distance, not doing anything. And if you read the description of their armor, you find out they're just dejectedly waiting for their lord to return, as Melania returned after fighting Radahn and comatose, and, well, Miquella never came back. And to take this idea further, these soldiers, well, some of them can do an attack where, let's just say, for YouTube terms of service purposes, that they self-immolate and then blow up, if that makes sense. You see, the downtrodden he was supposed to be protecting, you see them suffering, and purposelessly, as this place is long lost to the rot, it's just continuing to seep deeper and deeper into their quote-unquote new home. Bleeding and clinging on to life, we find Saint Trina. She wasn't simply left behind. She was thrown. She was cast into a lonely, desolate place to die and left to rot, in a weird way, just like his sister Melania. Is it any wonder that a man as wise and as fearsome as Ansbach tells us, there is nothing more terrifying? The only man with academic standards we meet in this whole game, Gideon, does not count, alright? He describes Miquella as a monster, full stop. The fear for me really starts to set in when you think about a world where everybody is under this supposedly perfect being spell. What if things need to change? No one can make that decision anymore. Nobody can have that thought, can have the will to power or to overthrow power or even just to improve power, because everything is now under one mind, one will, and that is essentially the exact same thing that Frenzied Flame would lead to. And don't believe me? Well, here's something interesting for you. Did you know Freya, one of Radahn's followers, has some text on her helmet that confirms Miquella was present at the Battle of Aeonia? You know, where Radahn whooped his sister comatose and she spread nuclear radiation through an entire region of the lands between? Yeah, he was there. In fact, we find out he healed Freya and cured her of the rot, which inspired devotion to him. Sounds nice, right? Yeah, well, sure does, until you consider the fact that, well, for all we know, the Scarlet Rot exists in Caelid in the way that it does because of Melania, and taking that a step further, she only nuked Caelid and did all of that under Miquella's bidding, and if you want to speculate, potentially even under his influence or manipulation, as we know this is something Melania would not do lightly, as it's something she spent her entire life trying to resist and avoid. And if you want more proof that Miquella was present, I think the fact that Melania was essentially comatose but survived the entire famous trek back to the Erdtree, where she was carried essentially by one of her Clean Rot knights. I think it's interesting that we find St. Trina's sword right near the entrance of Caelid, and, well, if you look at where Mogwyn Palace is lined up with a map, it's kind of underneath it, so maybe Miquella put Melania to sleep or did something to help her at least survive her way back to the Erdtree and then left to go, I don't know, hang out with Moog or whatever it was they were doing, something about a dynasty, I'm really not sure. I know many of you will be disagreeing right now and saying, well, of course Melania and Miquella loved each other. They had a deep bond, right? And he tried to cure her. That's such a big part of his character. And to be honest, I believe there was a time where, not just to Melania, but he meant his promises of compassion sincerely to everyone. Just like Marika at one point meant to create a world without death and meant all these promises of eternal life and endless gold and all this stuff, but as time goes on, the reality sets in, and those desires gave way to the urges and necessities and goals that were more inherent to Miquella and Marika themselves outside of the people they fought for or were trying to help. He, in many ways, is a direct foil to Marika, and of course there's desire to be better than this, to be different, to make up for the sins or rectify the mistakes of Marika, but I think at the end of the day, Miquella fails to truly question or wrestle with his potential to make the same mistakes, or even have already been making the same mistakes. After all, Miquella says at the cross above St. Trina's final resting place, "Here I abandon my love." If we take him at his word and say St. Trina is the aspect of Miquella that represents his love, then he made this decision to abandon her while she was still a part of him. And I think that, above all else, points to the fact that, well, he was willing to kill the part of himself that felt this love or compassion while it was present, before he had abandoned it. And that means that Miquella, as a being, he wasn't devoid of love making these decisions. It was a factor, he just didn't value it as much as he might claim to. And in this case, it drove him directly to a point where he chose to value his aspirations towards godhood over his love, even though that love was still present in the decision making. He just valued it less. And I don't know, I think St. Trina was just a casualty of that. It wasn't deeper than that, it was just what he had to do. And I think that concept in a being that is supposed to be compassionate is extremely contradictory, as that's apathy, that's cruelty towards the innocent, that's creating victims in the same way Marika did, and it doesn't give me any hope that he's truly better than her. And much like how Miquella and Melania, their cursed bodies and fates that they suffered, they're a consequence of Marika's ambitions and her decisions when she became a god. What if Melania was charmed, just like Radahn is now, right? What if all of this has been an exercise in narrative manipulation and control, and in the same way that Marika caused these curses in an attempt to suppress these things, maybe Miquella in an attempt to control or bring out what he thinks is the best or most loyal parts of people, maybe that's also causing all this havoc and death and destruction in the world inadvertently. And I think when you really look at how good he has gotten at manipulating and controlling people, there's evidence to point where his influence has been and where it hasn't been. And one of the biggest things for me that I use to help kind of decipher this, or even support the theory that Melania was at least in some way under his spell, is that, well, we hear her call out to him in her dying moments, and she calls him dear or dearest Miquella, right? And this could be a coincidence, right? But it is really reminiscent of how a lot of the followers only refer to him as like kind Miquella, kindly Miquella, tender Miquella, ever young Miquella, radiant Miquella, one of these positive things. And that isn't universal. This isn't just how people talk about Miquella, because if you ask Gideon about Miquella, he just calls him plain Miquella. And I think it's fair to say Gideon is certainly not charmed by him, nor it seems has ever met Miquella. So it's said that Miquella saw compassion in Radahn. That's the narrative, right? And that's why he made this heartfelt wish that Radahn would be his lord. But I honestly find that a bit of a stretch, as Radahn is pretty kind from what we know. His men revere and respect him. The commanders who served under him, they go well out of their way to honor his memory and legacy. We see them defending their old fortresses of Caelid and fighting back the rot of fire. Even though the land is long lost to them, they stay and continue to defend it, much like how Radahn, in cursed and rotted form, continued on after his battle with Melania, and while slowly losing his mind and being eaten away, he didn't fade away, he clung on to life. Radahn, he definitely has the capacity for kindness, but let's not forget, this is also Mr. Now I am Lord of the Battlefield, right? What is the quote? Once I was a champion's cub, and now I'm Lord of the Battlefield. Radahn, he definitely has the capacity for kindness, but he has significantly more capacity for warfare, if we're just being honest. He is more honorable than he is compassionate, I would say, which is why I disagree with some of the members of this community who explain the lore gaps or confusion around Radahn and Miquella's alliance by claiming that Radahn did in fact promise himself to be Miquella's lord and went back on that. Radahn, he doesn't get to speak to us, right? So this is speculative. Either time that we meet him, his mind has been eaten away by the rot, or he's under Miquella's control. And I think this is interesting because it mischaracterizes him in a lot of ways. Even though he looks like a brute, he's not. He's pretty intelligent master of sorcery who is a great leader. You would think he's a good orator. He inspires all this devotion, right? But we never get to talk to him. And so what we do learn about him for the most part is from characters like Jaren or the Redmanes that serve him and things that they've written or quoted, right? And they had a pact, him and Jaren, of honorable death with each other. Jaren, he'd been faithful well into his old age to that promise, and Radahn saw a lot of himself in Jaren, right? This is why they ended up together, working together, right? To explain that in a different way, Jaren used to be this nomadic warrior, but when he met Radahn, the two shared a camaraderie, and he ended up being honor-bound to serve as a commander in the Redmane or Radahn's armies, and this is a vow he took pretty seriously, as it would lead to an additional vow being sworn between the two of them, which was a vow of honorable death, and that means that, well, if one of them suffered a fate like Radahn's, the other would give them the peace and respect of a warrior's death that they deserved. This is a deep brotherhood and understanding between these two, and I find it highly unlikely that an honorable character like Radahn would break a vow so easily when we see Jaren fighting so hard to honor his to Radahn. And I find it just unlikely that the reason Radahn would fight Malenia would be due to betraying a promise to Miquella. So what are the alternatives, right? This is where this all led me, and I think we can learn a lot from the final cutscene of the DLC. For one, I think myself and others were too quick to assume who Miquella is talking to or about here, and when we talk to Saint Trina, she tells us godhood would be a prison to Miquella and begs us to make him stop. So why would a part of himself feel that, and what is driving that, and how long were these doubts brewing? Lord Brother is the words that Miquella uses to refer to Radahn in the beginning of this cutscene, and of course in the cutscene for the final boss battle, but it also is how he speaks to another character, and it's another one of his demigod siblings who he attempted to make his consort Godwyn. Also, if that sounds really weird, it's, just probably a good time to remind you that George R.R. Martin helped write the characters for this game. So, yeah, just anyway, Godwyn's death was strange. At least he was killed in soul alone, leaving his immortal, corporeal demigod form to just sort of decay and spread through the lands like a virus, but more specifically in the form of like a root. And this twisted kind of mutilation of Marika's golden child is, well, it's a direct offense to her order or her ideals of this golden, eternal, never-ending life, and it basically sets off the events of the Shattering War, which we know Radahn and Malenia, their fight was at the tail end of. So why would Miquella attempt to resurrect Godwyn to be his lord if Radahn had already promised him his loyalty? Don't doubt that Miquella at some point was promised a consort to rule at his side, as his eternal youth and nascency would be greatly helped by having a lord and an enforcer to kind of champion his age. I just kind of find it difficult to believe that this was Radahn. To go a step further, they don't ever explicitly mention his name. Once in that final cutscene, Miquella just says, "Lord Brother, I'm going to be a god. If we honor our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort. I'll make the world a gentler place." The more I go back to this, the more I question just who the hell is we. It doesn't tell us for certain.
We? Who's we?
But I always found it strange how Miquella's inflection changes between when he says, promise me you'll be my consort, and if we honor our part of the vow. Radahn is not part of the we making the vow to me. Radahn is the other. He is the you the vow is directed towards. And let's follow that rabbit hole even further. You can break down the many meanings of the word vow, but more specifically, vow is used as a synonym for prayer or incantation throughout Elden Ring. The best example being one of the most popular spells in the game, Golden Vow, a spell which has the player kneel and rise, kind of pledging their allegiance to gold or the Erdtree, right? And you draw from its power by doing this. And we see a vow of honorable death between Radahn and Jaren. We see another spell called the Vow of Silence. There's the Vow of the Indomitable. There's even a church of vows, which is where, interestingly enough, Radahn's parents, Radahn and Rennala, were married. So in each of these instances, these vows, they have some similarities, right? They're personal. We don't hear Malekith vowing to not let destined death be stolen again, but later find out he was actually speaking for the underpaid draconic tree sentinels outside. Like, people don't just cast Golden Vow to give the cat taking a nap in the corner a damage bonus. It's for you. It's for the person making the vow. And what's even more damning about this is we never hear a single thing from Radahn to make this lordship seem any more voluntary. I mean, why can't he talk if he's planning to be reborn into this? I mean, what's the sense in that, right? It just doesn't add up to me. And what we do here is very, very one-sided. The remembrance of a god and a lord, or the boss soul you get from defeating these two, states, his strength and his kindness stood in stark contrast to their afflicted selves, and I think the wording is really interesting there because I wouldn't describe Radahn as afflicted, so I think selves means Miquella and Melania, despite this being the remembrance of Radahn and Miquella, which brings us back to the question of who exactly is Miquella referring to when he says, if we honor our part of the vow. If it isn't Radahn and Miquella honoring a vow to each other, who is it? Well, in my opinion, this question's answered by the visuals of the ending cutscene more than it is by the dialogue. We see Miquella kneeling with his head bent and his hands clasped in prayer, and I couldn't help but notice how similar this was to a statue we find in the Erdtree depicting Miquella and Melania. Many have interpreted this statue as a depiction of Melania and Miquella's bond deepening through their mutual affection, and suffering, each attempting to kind of shield the other and ease their suffering. Melania more physically, Miquella more through his magic or his prayer in the way it's depicted, and it's a powerful image, right? We know that curing Melania was, at least at one point, a very large motivator for Miquella, and led him to abandon the Golden Order, as they could do nothing for her. I think this vow was made between Miquella and Melania to overcome their curses, right, and to bring about an age where the cursed and the afflicted no longer have to pay for the sins of others or the sins of their forefathers in particular. I believe this is the intention. It's a pure goal that he has, but somewhere along the way in that, I also think it's very likely that the original choice to be Miquella's lord was Godwyn, and perhaps that is why many have speculated like he planned to become a martyr for destined death. However, these hopes were dashed as Ranni carried out a cruel twisting of the knife. Yeah, you see what I did there?
The Erdtree was leading you all along, so that you might ascend to lordship. Why come to these lands to begin with? I suppose it must be what His Eminence, or perhaps the Erdtree, desired all along. The clashing of the favored lords, such that one would prevail. So be it. If you insist upon facing Miquella the Kind, then I will run you through whoever you might be. Don't tarry now. Don't you dare approach Miquella the Kind. Needle Knight's letter, Dryleaf Dane, and our allies will never allow this.
I am the Red Mane, Freya. The time has come. Look for a worthier foe. This is our moment. Let's make it something to remember.
Dignity of my lord and master, Mohg. Righteous tarnished. It appears that our interests have aligned. A balm upon my soul it is that we do not meet today. That was an astounding battle, to be sure. Now I suppose this leaves only one. But in truth, I cannot calm my quivering. Challenging a god is no small matter. Oh. Something you want to get off your chest? Well, you needn't worry. It was you, wasn't it? Who defeated Lord Mohg. Fear not. I bear no grudge against you. His Eminence was felled in an honorable duel. And such are the risks of seeking lordship. Besides, what right have I to complain? I blame the enchantment more than anything. Righteous Tarnished, we will have our victory. I swear upon my blood.
Why is Radahn's kindness identified as in stark contrast to Miquella the Kind? Why does everyone we meet under his spell laud his kindness and his coming age of compassion to redeem these war-torn lands when part of his very being, Saint Trina, begs us to make him stop? In my humble opinion, the reality of what he is about to do is far from the intention, and I believe just removing free will and charming his way to a peaceful world it's only going to serve to solidify those problems that the world faces, much like how Marika attempted to use her godhood to kind of eradicate or fix the problem of death and loss, and to protect the people she loves after losing so many of her kind. Miquella's compassion it's guaranteed to have unintended casualties and consequences that are antithetical to what he is trying to do, supposedly. And I think Radahn just exemplifies that so well. That's why he's so contradictory. Like, Miquella's desire to win at all costs, he's forgotten the emotion that made him embark on this journey in the first place. And the way he abandoned Saint Trina and even Melania in some ways, it's more than symbolic of that. Marika chose Godfrey for his strength, and that means to, kill all of her enemies. That is all they were together for. And while Miquella may have seen kindness in Radahn, he's doing the same thing here. Radahn isn't there because he's such a nice dude who loves horses. He's there to beat anyone who Miquella can't just manipulate or coerce into submission, and that's starting with you, the player. I can't help but find it a little funny that one of Miquella's first acts after being appointed the CEO of Empaths is to take the body of his brother Mohg, who he manipulated and got killed, then take the soul of his other brother, who he had his sister take out an entire country just to push Radahn a little closer to death, then desecrate both of them and their memories and legacies, denying Radahn his honorable death and denying Mohg even the most basic perspective like a burial or any other method of allowing someone to rest in peace. But all of this is in the name of creating the world's kindest and most compassionate warlord. I love the way that the gameplay of fighting Radahn really just mimics what it would be like to challenge a god. Like Ansbach says, it's no small matter, and compassionate or not, he's not going to be denied easily, and the honorable warrior that dueled Melania is really just a puppet now. There's something unnerving about the characterization of Radahn. I don't just mean his fight being so difficult, but no single moment in the DLC made my skin crawl more than Freya saying, as the Festival of War concluded, General Radahn's soul met an honorable end, but kindly Miquella wishes to revive it, which is fine by me. I know it would pain old Jaren, but war has always suited General Radahn best, and certainly far more than any honorable death. Endless war to invigorate the soul, as befits General Radahn, the Great Lion. You might see this as an insight into Radahn's character or Freya's, but it's really more of an insight into Miquella. Freya was once a member of General Radahn's personal guard, and we see just how strong the loyalty of his Redmanes are to this day as they still defend Caelid, but Miquella's influence over Freya supersedes this loyalty completely. Even as a member of his inner circle, she still has been so greatly influenced by Miquella that she would spite Radahn and Jaren and all of the knights and members of his army who are still loyal to him and enslave his soul to a god we have no evidence that he cared about. Why does she do this, despite it disrespecting and invalidating Jaren's efforts to honor Radahn? Freya believes she knows better than Jaren, and in some ways Radahn, and feels confident acting on her assumptions of what his best interests are. Does that remind you of anyone? Malenia had to sacrifice everything just to bring her fight with Radahn to a standstill, and he really, truly does feel like a god, an insurmountable obstacle, an innate force, an inevitability that no amount of struggling against will ever defeat or change even. And yet, even when it feels like I did everything I could, even when it feels like Gideon may have had a point when he claimed with his dying words that a man cannot kill a god, I choose with my own free will to remember the words of Sir Ansbach. And it reminds me that Radahn was like that once. If Ansbach falls in battle, his last words pass on that blazing strength of his as he tells us,
Righteous Tarnished, become our new lord. A lord not for gods, but for